By the end of this century, if emissions keep rising, the average temperature on Earth could go up another 4 to 8 degrees. What I'm saying is the planet's on fire.
I didn't feel the trauma of it all at the time.
Or just fire was everywhere.
Because of climate change, we're seeing more fire and we're seeing more intense fire.
You know, you're still thinking it's going to be okay.
Pretty intimidating, surreal experience to watch.
I'm Rob Smith from the Djawdano First Nation in British Columbia. I've crisscrossed the country to look at impacts of climate change. Sometimes my colleagues join me.
Well, all the people that you talk to, what do they talk about when it comes to climate change?
We'll get to Nunavut and its melting ice in part 2. But in this episode, we're starting with fire.
The fire came over the top of the hill. It came around down this way. It came in all directions.
Fanny Vance will never forget the summer of 2018.
Firefighters and then fighting fire for 40-some years have never ever seen a fire behave the way that this one did.
A massive forest fire ripped through her homeland. Telegraph Creek, a remote town located in northwestern British Columbia, home to the Tahltan Nation, built into the canyon walls along the Stikine River. The closest village is nearly 300 kilometers away. This narrow gravel road, the only way in and out.
They stayed there because there was some people trying to come back in.
Fanny operates Riversong Cafe and Lodge, a historic site from the time of the gold rush.
I invested a lot of time in that place, and you know, being a big part of history of Telegraph Creek, and I really thought it was going to be the last time I saw it. The fire is about 300 feet in the air, right on the top there on the the horizon. It's like spiraling, like like a fire tornado.
Like Fanny Vance's homeland, the world is burning. It's also melting, flooding, and drying up. For me and my generation, climate change has been a lifelong existential threat.
The environment in many ways is being ravished.
If there is a species at risk, it's humanity.
Scientists first warned politicians about the dangers of rising CO2 levels way back in the 50s. That's nearly 70 years we've had to fix this thing.
Climate change is inextricably linked to some of the most pressing security challenges of our time.
By 2050, 200 million people every year could need international humanitarian aid.
The link between climate change and the destruction of forests is a devastating one.
The average global temperature has risen just over 1 degree since the Industrial Revolution. 1 degree doesn't sound like much, but keep in mind, science tells us things get bad at 1.5 degrees.
I want to take a moment.
To be fair, mankind has tried.
Of the climate change negotiations that have just been completed in Japan.
In 1997, a failed attempt with the Kyoto Protocol.
L'accord de Paris pour le climat est accepté.
In 2015, a second kick at the can, the Paris Agreement.
This is really a total fraud. We're not going to reduce emissions as long as we let fossil fuels be the cheapest form of energy. The United Nations has drawn together a group of international scientists.
the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. Prior to Paris, 2 degrees was the do not pass threshold, predicted for sometime near the end of the century.
Subsequent work showed that even at 2 degrees there would be large impacts, and so the impetus was to be more ambitious in the target and aim for 1.5 degrees.
The United Nations created the IPCC in 1988. The panel gathers up research from around the globe, a kind of one-stop shop for the world's policymakers. 1.5 degrees is just a decade away. Greg Flato is a senior researcher.
In order to get to limit temperatures to 1.5 degrees, emissions have to get to net zero by the middle of this century.
With this sped up timeline, some researchers bang the drum louder. Their words, at times, terrifying. Even some of the world's biggest banks, like HSBC, are issuing warnings. The health costs alone could soar to nearly $10 trillion a year by 2050. Respiratory problems, heat stroke, dehydration, and a spike in diseases, and a major theme: companies and governments are not prepared for what's coming. So time out. The media has faced criticism in the past for how we've covered this story. So a quick word about where we're coming from. First off, we feel zero pressure to get both sides of the story. The science is in. And second, we are not fear-mongering. The outlook is grim, and we should be afraid about what experts are saying is coming. This sociologist gives us some advice to ensure the message lands.
Raising specters of fear is not likely to be that successful. You have to emphasize the impact on people and not necessarily on polar bears.
And Professor Lindell reminds us to sprinkle in some optimism.
Maybe the manifestations of climate change will lead to human deaths and maybe wars and refugees and so on. But, you know, the planet is not going to come to a crashing end.
We will do our best to keep the scare tactics like this to a minimum.
And we fool ourselves if we think we can fool nature. Because nature always strikes back.
Telegraph Creek was evacuated as the fires raged in 2018. Fanny left, but came back to help feed and house the firefighters.
It was addicting. You had to watch it, right? It was a psychological torture watching it come burn down the river for, we were here 7 days, and then to finally actually see it get that close. And
it was just burning, glowing red.
Rick McLean, chief of the Tahltan Nation.
Yeah, I was also told that it moved so slow because it was running into that wind.
Yeah, it was burning against the wind, you know, on that side of the river, right?
Yeah, so that seems odd.
Yeah,
like, why wouldn't it just burn backwards?
Yeah, it was blowing 70 kilometers an hour that way, and it's still burning this way.
Just start with your name, and if you could spell it for me, that'd be great.
Alice Hamlin Auger, a Tahltan elder, describes weather conditions that make a massive fire inevitable.
We had really strong winds last summer, and it was very, very dry, and we hadn't had a rain in over a year at that point.
Forest fires are a natural occurrence, needed, in fact, to foster a healthy forest. But latest studies predict larger, more intense fires due to climate change. Canada now predicts severe environmental and economic consequences due to forest fires. A year after Telegraph Creek burned, another fire outside of Soyuz, British Columbia.
We're seeing more destructive fires. The numbers don't lie.
Talk to some firefighters who say the behavior of some of these larger fires are stuff that they haven't seen before. Is that something you witnessed?
Absolutely. The last couple of years, the fire behavior has been incredible, and that's a product of sustained hot weather with lack of rain.
In a province where the oil industry is king, it can be dangerous to draw a line between fossil fuels and forest fires.
So I get death threats. And it's usually the Calgary Herald. Whenever anything about climate change in the Calgary Herald, they come out of the floorboards.
For Mike Flanagan, professor at the University of Alberta, it's simple. The facts are the facts.
Temperatures in western and northern Canada have doubled or tripled what the global average is in terms of warming. And we're seeing that's where the biggest increases of fire activity are in western and northern Canada.
And the professor has a message for anyone questioning the science.
Climate change is here. We're seeing more fire, more intense fire than we've ever seen. And you just need to talk to firefighters, people who've been fighting fires for many years, and they've seen nothing like what we've seen recently. And this is a trend, and it's only going to get worse.
Coming up after the break, Telegraph Creek fights the fire.
The firefighters came down and said, "You get the hell out." He literally threw me in my truck and my dog and told me to get the hell out of town.
We'll hear about acts of heroism.
We should screw to your bridge. The fire's coming over the friggin' hill here, man.
And people reflect on the cost.
The people that lost everything are the ones that they're taking it the hardest.
Okay, this is where I lived over here. That way, where that blue car is.
In the summer of 2018, the Tahltan Nation faced a monster fire. No one died, but 125,000 hectares were destroyed. A dozen buildings and 20 homes were lost.
Fire went through this way, and then another one was coming this way. It was like we were surrounded here.
The whole hillside and sky was the sky was red with fire and smoke, and it was a pretty extremely intimidating sight.
Fanny's partner at the time was Tahltan Chief Rick McLean. He says people jumped into action.
All the guys, the cats and excavators were up there building fire guard above town, and this guy, I think might have been Dwayne Day, come down over the hill he got a D6, and the fire was right on his heels, and he come down and brought the cat down over the hill here. The other guys were working on the guard up this way, and they had a big clearing there. They just parked all that equipment in the middle of the clearing and jumped out and ran down over the hill.
Dry, windy conditions fed the fire.
The dry index for our area for last year was the highest it's ever been since they started recording it.
You got to get rid of the leaves, you got to get rid of the debris, you got to get rid of the fallen trees, you know.
The deniers must be frustrating to you on a personal level, though.
And we see that there's more energy coming in than it is going out. So therefore, the planet is going to continue to get warmer.
Especially now that they're in positions of high influence and power.
I think the science is far from settled. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We're not going to succeed together protecting Californians.
Okay, it'll start getting cooler. You just watch.
I wish science agreed with you.
Well, I don't think science knows, actually.
Well, I think that scientific information always ultimately triumphs in the sense that facts are facts. The evidence is clear. Despite the overwhelming evidence, where's the panic, the demand for change?
There are some evolutionary forces in our brain that lead us to just focus on the short term. In the old days, we were focused on finding food and finding shelter and dealing with immediate things and not worrying about things that might happen in 5 years or 10 years or 50 years.
The people of Telegraph Creek couldn't ignore it. It was right at their doorstep.
Yeah, I get that. We'll just put it on the other side. Oh.
You're firing me?
Fanny introduces me to her neighbor, Mickey Ferguson.
Well, lots of them
Mickey was part of a group that ignored the evacuation order, risking their lives to put sprinklers on homes about to burn.
Did you do this on your own? Were you asked to do it by somebody? Or?
No, shit. No, we weren't asked by nobody. It's just common sense. It's coming at you, man. You got to try and do something about it, eh? Yeah.
And how
well,
did
most people wouldn't stay that do that.
Yeah, I guess. But whatever, yeah.
Ferguson convinced a fire crew sent to save bridges to stay and save houses.
Even a helicopter pilot helped us at the end for a while because he came to get those 2 young guys. So they put sprinklers on the waterfall bridge, and then they were going to get choppered out and go out to Tuya and do that. And we said, screw Tuya Bridge. The fire's coming over the friggin' hill here, man. So then they stayed. They listened to us, so.
Were you able to save those houses, or did they go in the end? Or?
No, everyone we put sprinklers on was saved.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
About 17, I think, or somewhere in that neighborhood.
We're very grateful and thankful to those guys for doing that, right? They risked their lives by staying here. You know, it's a commendable act by some very brave men.
And the 5 warmest Augusts on record have been since 2015. The heat has contributed to a very, very destructive fire season. As we know, the states of California, Oregon, and Washington have been worst hit. Entire neighborhoods razed to the ground, forcing the evacuation of hundreds of thousands of people and tragically causing casualties.
That 1.5 degrees and global warming we've talked about seeing in a decade or so, that's not a starting line. Climate change is happening now. The last decade was the hottest decade on record. UN warns we aren't close to meeting that 1.5 degree target. 3 degrees is likely. Some suggest if we get to 5 degrees, that's the end for us. Climate change science is not controversial, but the politics of climate change is. Psychologists take a look at how our complex brains work, and their theories may answer the questions we've had about how denial works and how it's triggered. Anthropocentrism is a way of thinking about the world that puts humankind first and foremost and discounts nature.
Part of anthropocentrism as well is to think that we're somehow immune to natural systems. So even if climate change is real, sooner or later through science and technology, we can come up with a solution. This is, a version of psychological denial that it rewards, just discounting things, and then you don't really need to do too much.
But wait, there's more. One process known as identity protective cognition, the thesis suggests an evolved type of peer pressure or tribalism. When facts conflict with core beliefs of your chosen social group, your brain, well, it puts up a wall to block the information. Another process, illusionary truth effect, comes down to this. If a lie is repeated enough, your brain could start to process it as a fact. And here's the kicker. It could happen even if you already know the truth. Studies show this is not an issue of intelligence or lack of education. Both effects are subconscious. Your mind playing tricks on you.
Rick was, he came down and I told you he came running into the restaurant. And he told us everybody had to get the hell out because the fire's coming down the creek, and he was crying.
The forest fire was closing in on Telegraph Creek. The evacuation stories are wild. Things got real and surreal fast.
It was very smoky, ashes falling. I think in some parts there was embers. It was a long trip.
But everybody was just out of it, People were running all over. I took my jewelry, which I think probably all women think of their jewelry, Just grab the box and take it with you,
And down by the graveyard, there's the friggin' fire truck parked with all the four-way blinkers going, the keys in the ignition, the radio left laying on the seat, and everybody's out of town, and this thing's just blinking. You know, it was like something out of a friggin' Stephen King novel. You know,
adaptation is clearly an important part of the overall response to a changing climate, because the climate has already warmed. It will inevitably continue to warm.
In 2019, insurers paid out $1.3 billion for damages incurred due to severe weather.
Well, that's gorgeous.
Yeah.
Mind if I get out?
Yeah.
How do you measure the emotional and mental costs?
So my nightmares are the fire burning over the back of that bluff and coming down at me like a wave, like a ocean wave.
People in psychology and related sorts of fields are starting to look at things like climate grief and, you know, increased anxiety.
The material loss was huge, but there's a lot of emotional and intimate relationships that were lost as well.
Fanny and Rick's relationship didn't survive the fire of 2018, but the community will adapt. The Tahltan aren't going anywhere.
Coming into Telegraph was, it was really, really hard. Everything is okay, it's okay, it's okay, and all of a sudden you hit the devastation. And it was like, holy crap, what happened here? The front door was over here, yeah. It was about here, the front door. There was a two-story split level.
A sandlot where a home of nearly 30 years once stood. The only thing left, a burnt-out old car.
We had everything here that you could possibly want and need, and for all the comforts we could need, you know. So that I guess that's probably what I miss most, is the comfort of being at home and feeling when you're away and you come back, you know you're at home.
Next week, we go to Nunavut, where the climate change threat has been ongoing for decades.
We need water for our animals, and we need water for ourselves too.
And what you're seeing there especially is the critical loss of sea ice as a habitat.